Hello guys, this is Jack, and today I'm going to be reviewing Blitz, which is the new film by Steve McQueen. I saw this Friday at the New York Film Festival, just for only 2 hours. It was the only film that I saw at the New York Film Festival, aside from The Nickel Boys, which I saw last week at the Alamo, Staten Island. And I saw it with a bunch of friends, and I actually want to review this film because it's one of my most anticipated films of the year because of Steve McQueen, the director. He directed a bunch of great films like 12 Years a Slave, Widows, and the entire Small Axe series. So I want to go into sort of a deep dive into this movie, but not in a spoilery way. So let's get started with Blitz. So this new film stars Saoirse Ronan playing Rita, and then Elliot Heffernan playing Elliot, the little boy, who is basically the central character of the film, as George is being sent away from World War II London, where around this time there was bombings happening around London, and a lot of people were forced to go under the tunnels to escape from the bombings in the nighttime, and then during the daytime they can just hang out and be normal people. But George has to be sent away from the countryside to avoid all of these bombings. And right when George is on the train to the countryside, he decides to jump off the train and go back to London to see his mother because he's pretty pissed off about the whole ideal. But the movie basically starts in the first 30 minutes of George trying to be rebellious and be kind of away from his mother's instincts. And Rita, played by Saoirse Ronan, is at a fall where she's working at a factory making bombs for the soldiers. And the whole time she's kind of at a point where she doesn't want to be in the factory. She wants to get out there and protest and be a part of the people who are against the war and want to succeed in peace. And throughout the entire film, you have two storylines where George is running back to his mother, and the whole time he's being caught up by a lot of these evil people around London. One of them played by Stephen Graham, who is basically a robber and wants to rob a bunch of jewelry from dead people who were killed during these acts of violence. And there's a whole Oliver Twist moment where George is forced to rob a bunch of jewelry from these people, and he's held hostage. Meanwhile, also Rita is trapped in this tunnel full of people, and she reluctantly tries to join a team of people who want to help these people who have been injured during the bombings. And it's a whole conflicting two storylines that eventually converge near the end once George and Rita finally return to each other. It's not really a spoiler, but that's how the film goes throughout the entire film. The problem that I personally have with the film is that it's very on the nose with its themes of racism, but also it's very kind of Steven Spielbergian, and it's very much a copy of his other films like Empire of the Sun and Munich, but in more of a PG-13 territory where it doesn't completely offend everybody. But I think aside from that, I think Steve McQueen competently directs this film. He makes it feel kind of still combative and very immersive with the themes of racism and war and how it affects children, especially when George eventually gets out of the train and then eventually tries to come back to London. The first kind of instinct of rebellious nature is when George meets up with these kids who are trapped in a boxcar who also escaped from the countryside train. And it's a whole thing where George starts to realize that the actions that he did are very heinous and very strenuous to his own nature, and he suddenly starts to learn how war works in kind of these hard situations. And yeah, it's very, again, on the nose with that, but I think the actor Elliot does a really good job conveying all those emotions of how to be a kid around this time. And I would say the same with Saoirse Ronan, who is really great despite her limited screen time. She's more of a supporting role than a leading role, but of course the film kind of attends more to her in some scenes and then back to George. But I actually really liked her storyline, especially when she's trying to go back to the tunnels and she's learning more about the people around her. And there's also a really great kind of small moment with George and the actor Benjamin Clementine, or Clement. He's actually a singer that I actually know from a long time ago, but he plays a soldier, a Nigerian soldier, who helps George escape the tunnels and kind of like hangs out with them and kind of like learns more about like how tunnels work, and it's like really interesting. And there's also like musical moments where like Saoirse Ronan, she's also kind of like a singer, she sings at like this factory and she's trying to like get the message out about like opening up more tunnels for people to like go in while like the bombings are happening, and it's a whole thing, and like BBC is trying to like censor her. And that aspect was really interesting. And there's also a moment near the end where the film kind of just stops with like the sound and like the bombings, and you see like a wide shot of like the skyline of the entire London landscape being like bombed or was bombed. And I thought like the sounds of like silence, and then also just the sounds of like bombings and other like planes going like in and out was like really visceral and like interesting. And I think that's like the positive aspect of this film is like the sound design and the sound editing is like really great and very immersive. But again, I think the problem that I have with it is that it conflicts a lot with like multiple storylines as you're following George, and then he just goes one by one through like these acts of just violence and war. Pretty, again, like on the nose, even to the point where he meets Stephen Graham, and it's a whole like Oliver Twist moment where you're just like, this just like came out of nowhere. I don't know what happened here. But again, I think near the end, it kind of ties everything together, and I enjoyed it. I do think it's like Steve McQueen's weakest film out of his filmography, in my opinion. And if you can like kind of like call, was it the Small Axe series, like his other like 7 films or 6 films, feature length, I think it's like way weaker than those other like Small Axe films. It's pretty like resemblant to the Small Axe series, but again, it's also dealing with just history of London and British history. And I think Steve McQueen, for what he tries to do with this film, he does it pretty competently, pretty like streamlined and like straightforward. It's not like audacious or like very experimental. It's just straightforward. And I was very surprised by that. I thought it was actually going to be more of like 12 Years a Slave, where there's actually kind of like a visceral, like audacious experience where it's playing around with like sound and like editing. But here it's just straightforward. But I don't really have anything substantial to like say about like the direction of this film. It's very, again, streamlined. But I do think it's very like Oscar baity. It's not like completely, again, experimental. But again, I think this is very like soft for the top 10 like Best Picture list. I think it will slide in there, but I don't know if it will be confidently like in the top 10 compared to like other films that I think will have a better like shot. But again, I think Saoirse Ronan and Elliot Heffernan both give like really great performances, and like Harris Dickinson shows up for like 5 minutes and he's like completely like underutilized, and that kind of like disappointed me a little bit. But then yet again, I think the whole kind of like point of the film is to show like, again, the acts of war and like how terrible it was back then, and how the people were trying to like rise up against these acts of violence. And I think that like thematic in mind does a really good job, again, in a very like on the nose kind of territory. But yeah, that's like my review of Blitz. I give this a 3.5 out of 5. Again, I think this is just aggressively okay, but I was still captivated by a lot of the stuff that was happening, especially near the last 30 minutes of the film, where George, again, is trying to really like find his way home, and there's just like bad stuff happening after bad stuff happening, and eventually once everything comes together, you feel kind of like the emotion near the end. But yeah, that's my review of Blitz. I'm going to be reviewing Nickel Boys pretty soon, so keep an eye on that. Hope you guys enjoyed this video. Peace out.